first was noticed in 1853 by the British botanist Richard Spruce, who was making collections on a river in Brazil, and he observed the people making some kind of an intoxicant out of this vine. And then a couple of years later, 1,000 miles away in a different part of the scene, he saw the same thing going on, and he noticed that this was a vine in the Malphigaceae. This is the family. Plants are divided as animals are divided into families, genuses, and species. And the Malphigaceae is this large family of tropical climbers. And not a whole lot was done with it. In the early 1900s, German ethnographers like Theodor Koch-Grünberg wrote about it and may have brought some samples back to Germany. But it really wasn't until the 1930s that anybody looked at this. Well, when you start looking, it's very interesting. It's there are all kinds of interesting things about it. It's a combinatory drug. It's not like peyote or mushrooms or datura, where one plant contains the full spectrum of the alkaloids necessary for the activity. It's a situation where two plants have to be brought together and combined in a certain ratio. And the way it's made and the plants that it's made with vary over a large area in the Amazon according to what plants are locally available. Also, the methods of preparation vary. So sometimes it's what's called a cold water infusion. That means that the smashed stalks of vine and the extractive chemistry works. The more gentle the extraction, the more complex the materials that will come out. So in a plant like Monasteriopsis caapi, you have at least three things that are potentially active: harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharman. The more complex the molecule, the general rule of thumb is the more complex the molecule, the easier it is on your system. So if you do a cold water infusion of Monasteriopsis caapi, what you get is the harmaline and the tetrahydroharman, and it tends to leave the harmine behind. But it also tends to be, because of this, less effective. All three of these compounds are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. That means that all three of them will contribute to synergizing DMT, which is present in the brew from the additional admixture. And the whole technology of ayahuasca is a technology of bringing these two plants together in correct ratios so that you strongly synergize visions, but not so strongly accentuate the unpleasant side effects of harmine, which are, basically vomiting, an intense gastric rejection of it. This happens anyway. It's very purgative. So what evolved in Peru, and we have no notion of how long it's been going on, it's very hard to get archaeological evidence of drug use because it's such a subtle cultural phenomenon unless you actually find the ancient drugs, as in the case of some of the snuffs that have been found in the deserts of southern Chile recently. You're going to have to work from conjecture, mythology, possible vase paintings and stuff like that, or paraphernalia. the paraphernalia of the snuff cult makes it identifiable when you come upon it. But the paraphernalia of the ayahuasca cult is simply the same paraphernalia people use to cook and prepare food in the jungle. I mean, it's fires and pots and smashers and choppers. Anyway, for a very long time, this has been going on in South America. And it's still really to be studied. It's been kind of ignored. It's slightly surprising how ignored it's been because it represents such a major psychedelic religion. I mean, probably millions of people, possibly millions of people, I would think, are involved in this right now. And it's hard to say whether it's growing or shrinking. Peru, which is one of the 4 or 5 countries where this is going on in a major way, is in a lot of turmoil. On the other hand, turmoil has characterized most of its history. Ayahuasca is a phenomenon of the country people, of the campesinos and the mestizos, and it's undergoing change in different directions. You know, there's a lot of syncretic religious foment in Brazil. Elements of Santeria and Caribbean religions and Catholicism and psychic healing and European occultism is all in ferment there. And so is the ayahuasca, which in Brazil is called daime, is in the last 50 or 60 years been appropriated by these quasi-religious groups. There are 2 major groups in Brazil involved in this. One is called the União Vegetal, and it seems to be on the lower river, meaning below Manaus, which means in the large cities. And they are brewing a weakened form of ayahuasca, which they call, I think they call it huasca. And then further up the river, the Santo Daime people, who are a little more distinctive, but not, to my mind, terribly attractive. They wear uniforms and practice paramilitary maneuvers and have some peculiar theology of cultural revitalization based on the use of daime. I know those people have been coming to Argentina and Los Angeles recently and beginning circles, so I think there is some sense in the native ayahuasca movements that perhaps the time has come to try and export this out of the cultures where it first came into existence and into modern life. As for what it is, it's very interesting. It is extraordinarily restorative. It is a purgative. What we know medically about it is that it is a strong purgative, that it kills intestinal parasites, and that it has possibly an adverse effect on the trypanosomal stage of the malaria organism. They did experiments at the University of California Medical Center in San Francisco where they were able to kill trypanosomes on Petri plates with small amounts of dilute ayahuasca. Well, if this were to stand up over time, you would see that this had then a very strong impact on people's adaptive, the cultural adaptive response to malaria in the Amazon. You would almost have to say that people who didn't take this stuff were at serious risk to be in these places because malaria is so all-pervasive. And a system of curing has grown up around this, a whole medical system that is now in great danger of being lost or forgotten or quackized in some way, because people are getting into it who know very little about it. In the traditional situation, a long apprenticeship was required to be able to give this stuff to people and to be able to take it, and a diet. And there are many, many things that we could say about it that set it apart and make it interesting. It's running on, as I said, harmine and on dimethyltryptamine, DMT, to accentuate the visions. Well, these two compounds are both endogenous hallucinogens. That means both of these compounds occur in the human body under ordinary circumstances, in the human brain. So, in a way, what we have with ayahuasca is not a kind of folk pharmaceutical intervention in illness or neurosis, but actually a brain cocktail, a shifting of ratios, and accentuating and a saturating with compounds already a part of normal metabolism. Well, in spite of the fact that these things are constituents of normal metabolism, the way this presents itself is as a profound visionary experience. So that and it's fairly brief. It lasts about 4 hours, and then there's a long gliding integration, and there is never a particular energy loss. In a way, you seem to have taken one small step which you are not asked to retract. There is no energy debt. This is very interesting and is a hint that the right strategy with these shamanic hallucinogens is this effort to see them as intervention into ordinary brain chemistry that is shifting ratios but not adding new factors into the mix. And I don't know how many of you have been here for all of these lectures, but in many of the lectures we've touched on the unique ability of ayahuasca to promote synergy, synesthesias, situations where music is beheld, specifically the self-generated music of these tribal groups, that these songs that are being sung are to be appreciated pictorially. They are sculptural constructs in an idiom of sound that is intended to be beheld. So, and this is something that we have no cultural lock on. We have nothing comparable to this. When the people like Koch Grünberg and the early people into the Amazon began naming the suspected active agent in ayahuasca, they called it telepathy, because they believed that group states of mind were being generated in these tribal groups. And in fact, this is not that far off the mark. I mean, a kind of pedestrian notion of telepathy is, I think you hear what I think. But notice that even though thinking is not an audio function, the cultural assumption is that thought would be heard. There's no reason for this. I mean, thought could be felt or it could be seen. And this, in fact, appears to be what is happening. DMT, this domain of compounds that I'm interested in, that I keep restricting our attention to, these indole tryptamine hallucinogens, it's because they are so much like brain chemistry, and they act so directly on the language forming centers. DMT can trigger spontaneous glossolalia, the shift in neural processing that takes place in the presence of ayahuasca causes songs to be beheld. What we're moving here in is the realm of signal processing, perception, and language generation. This is where these things are particularly targeting, and in different ways. For instance, I talked about how the mushroom speaks. Psilocybin, 5-hydroxy-N-dimethyltryptamine. Again, just a gnat's eyelash away from these other compounds. It speaks. Another causes music to be visible, so forth and so on. Another triggers glossolalia. So for me, what is interesting about the ayahuasca phenomenon is the idea that what is happening here is a kind of recreation in the new world of this symbiosis with a plant that I suspect lay behind our prehistoric condition. That in the past, before history, during the melting of the last glaciers and before, 15 to 25,000 or more years ago, a whole different kind of mental life was available to human beings. And it was not a diminished or brutish mental life. It was a tremendously rich, integrated kind of mental existence that lay beyond the contradictions of dualism and class structure and division of labor and all of these things that we associate with our fall into history.